Hi everyone, I'm honored to be here, even if only virtually, and would like to thank Exclamation for having me at this year's summer conference and the audience for taking the time to watch. If after this presentation you have any questions or wish to discuss anything further, please feel free to contact me using the email address on the slide. So today I'm going to speak about James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, starting with a brief overview of the novel and moving on to look at Joycean Epiphany, with particular emphasis on what I consider the two crucial moments of epiphany in a portrait, namely the dream of hell from chapter 3 and the vision of the bird-like girl from chapter 4. I attempt to analyze both instances from a Freudian perspective. Joyce's novel is a semi-autobiographical Kanzlerroman, considered a subcategory of the Bildungsroman. This type of novel traces the development of an artist from childhood to maturity. A Portrait was initially a 63-chapter realistic autobiographical novel entitled Stephen Hero. Later, it became the modernist condensed 5-chapter novel in which the author uses free indirect speech and the stream of consciousness technique. Thus, the novel follows Stephen Dedalus, the protagonist, from boyhood to adulthood, emphasizing in turn his religious and artistic awakenings. The first chapter follows Stephen's days at Clongowes Wood College, a Jesuit boarding school. His schoolboy days are marked by his classmates' mockery of his homesickness and his attempts to adapt and fit in. In chapter 2, due to financial problems, Stephen's family moves to Dublin. Here, Stephen meets E.C., a neighbouring girl whose name is given as Emma in chapter 3, with whom he falls in love. The chapter continues with Stephen's teenage years and his enrollment at Belvedere College. Chapter 3 moves between Stephen's lust, manifested through his continued visits to brothels, and his increasing fear of eternal damnation. At Belvedere, during a 3-day spiritual retreat, preceding St. Francis Xavier's feast day, Stephen hears 3 sermons on the tortures of hell. On the third night, Stephen has the dream of hell that determines him to confess his sins and turn to a new life of piety. Chapter 4 shows an almost fanatically pious Stephen. The director of the school, having noticed Stephen's apparent righteousness, asks him to consider priesthood. He contemplates the solitary life of a priest and his life at home. The vision of the bird-like girl, his muse, which is akin to divine revelation, makes him decide life is worth living, marking his artistic awakening. The final chapter focuses on Stephen's university years and his artistic maturity. Turning now to a more general discussion of Joycean epiphanies, it is worth mentioning that critics such as Tobias Bose and David Heyman provide an insightful analysis of the term. In The Purpose and Permanence of Joycean Epiphany, Heyman points out that Joyce's early writings are key in understanding the role of epiphany in Joyce's early artistic development. He looks at the origins of Joycean epiphanies in his novels Stephen Hero, A Portrait and Ulysses, origins traced back to Joyce's own moments of epiphany written at University College. Both in his article entitled A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and the Individuating Rhythm of Modernity points out that, stylistically, epiphany and leitmotif can hardly be separated from one another in Stephen's journey, marked by multiple versions of his self. In what follows, I will explore the 2 key moments of epiphany, which function either as an appearance or manifestation, especially of a divine being, or as an intuitive grasp of reality through something usually simple and striking, and analyze them through psychoanalytical lenses. The first moment of epiphany I discuss here, Stephen's dream of hell, is closely linked to his religious upbringing. Thus, at Clongowes, Stephen has to do everything well and in due time, so that he might not go to hell when he dies. His schoolboy days are also marked by a sense of inferiority. For instance, the narrator mentions how it pained Stephen that he did not know well what politics meant, and that he did not know where the universe ended. He felt small and weak. When would he be like the fellows in poetry and rhetoric? His sense of not belonging is accentuated in chapter 2. Stephen's time at home makes him yearn for the outside unknown world that was out of bounds at Clongowes. Chapter 1 then arguably foreshadows a more pointed conflict between religious life and the outside life, between Catholic righteousness and aesthetic pleasure that appears from chapter 3 onwards. His attitude towards school and religion changes once he enrolls at Belvedere College. Here it seems Stephen starts straying away from religion. See for instance the accusation of heresy on pages 59 to 60, or his admiration of Lord Byron's poetry on page 61. At the same time, his repressed desire for Emma seems to be the cause of the cruel and loveless lust to which he surrenders by the end of chapter 2, when he accepts the solicitation of a prostitute. By chapter 3, Stephen takes pride in his lust, believing that it was his own soul going forth to experience, unfolding itself scene by scene, spreading abroad the pale fire of its burning stars, and folding back upon itself, fading slowly, quenching its own lights and fires. The turning point and origin of his later dream of hell begins with Stephen's realization of the danger of eternal damnation that awaits him, and of the fact that his soul lusted after its own destruction. In his interpretation of dreams, Sigmund Freud argues that neurotic fear has its origin in the sexual life and corresponds to a libido which has been turned away from its object and has not succeeded in being applied. I would equate this idea with Stephen's repressed desire for Emma, and later his repressed sexuality after he realizes the danger of eternal damnation, as the causes of his falling into sin and then fearing punishment for it. It is during the days of the retreat and through Father Arnold's previously mentioned sermons that Stephen's fear at the prospect of hell emerges more clearly. The vivid images suggested by Father Arnold, the fear they inspire in Stephen, directly lead to his dream of hell. He awakens suddenly, struggling for air, realizing that was his hell. God had allowed him to see the hell reserved for his sins. Stinking, bestial, malignant, a hell of lecherous, goatish fiends. Freud also notes that for the ancients the dream resulted from the will of the divine or demonical powers, and its content was the product of their knowledge or intention. Like the ancients, Stephen believes his dream to arise from divine will as a second chance to repent. However, from a scientific viewpoint, Stephen's dream of hell can be argued to stem from what Freud terms internal sensory stimuli. Freud draws on Alfred Maury's Les Sommeils rêves in claiming that, if one awakens shortly thereafter, it is often possible to demonstrate the same pictures in the dream which one has perceived as hypnagogic hallucinations before falling asleep. In other words, Stephen falls asleep with the images suggested by Father Arnold still fresh on his mind, correlated with his sense of fear as an internal inducement. Freud equally points out in Beyond the Pleasure Principle that the counterpart of the anxiety dreams, which he calls punishment dreams, are dreams that have the role to replace the forbidden wish fulfillment by the appropriate punishment for it. That is to say, They fulfill the wish of the sense of guilt, which is the reaction to the repudiated impulse. As a consequence of the dream, of his fear and his guilt, Stephen returns to a perceived path of righteousness. He prays and is prompted to confess, and after confessing his sins, Stephen believes to have begun another life, a life of grace and virtue and happiness. I would argue instead that Stephen's newfound piety is not entirely sincere, or rather that he goes too rapidly from one extreme, namely indulging in his lust, to another, namely shunning all worldly things, shunning life in itself. Stephen's nearly fanatical piety is, in the second part of the novel, what arguably leads to his second key moment of epiphany, namely the vision of the bird-like girl. From his fear of hell, Stephen goes forth to repress his senses. Each sense has to be submitted to a rigorous discipline. Along with the punishments he applies to himself, Stephen also voices uncertainty towards his new way of life, wondering if he had not had sincere sorrow for his sin, or if he had truly amended his life. It seems that, along with the reader, or at least with this reader, the protagonist realizes that only fear of eternal punishment made him radically change his life. Stephen reaches the point where he has to contemplate becoming a priest and entering a grave and ordered and passionate life, or decide against it and keep his freedom. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud proposes a distinction between fear and anxiety that need not seem to be mentioned in the interpretation of dreams. Thus he notes that anxiety describes a particular state of expecting the danger or preparing for it, even though it may be an unknown one. Fear requires a definite object of which to be afraid. Where fear prompted Stephen to dream of his personal hell and repent, anxiety at the prospect of losing his freedom, masked as anxiety at not being made for priesthood, is arguably what determines him to choose life as an artist. The vision of his muse appears to him in these moments of contemplation. Now, at the name of the fabulous artificer, Daedalus the maze-maker from Greek mythology, he seemed to hear the noise of dim waves and to see a winged form flying above the waves and slowly climbing the air. What did it mean? Where in the first part of the novel repenting for his sins could be correlated to the symbolism of his first name, Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, his surname represents the other side of life he is drawn towards. Like his namesake, he is to become a symbol of the artist. Stephen's vision of the girl resembling a beautiful seabird represents the call of life to his soul, not the dull, gross voice of the world of duties and despair, not the inhuman voice that had called him to the pale service of the altar. If it is to be considered just a hallucination, his vision can be seen as wish fulfillment, leading him to radically change the course of his life. The beautiful bird-like girl stands for Stephen's inclination towards aesthetic pleasure the moment he has a nearly divine revelation, noting, to live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him in an instant of ecstasy the gates of all ways of error and glory. Stephen thus regains the freedom he feared losing by becoming a priest. He realizes that there is more to life than religion or politics or sin or any other thing that marked his development up to this moment. To sum up, I hope I have shown that the two moments of epiphany represent turning points in Stephen's life. While the dream of hell saves him from a depraved life only to put him in a false piousness, the vision of his muse shows him his true vocation, that of an artist, a writer. Seen in retrospective, all aspects of the novel, of Stephen's development, contribute to his final decision to become an artist, to enjoy life's aesthetic appeal, and to seek his fortune in exile, that is, not in the religious Ireland of his childhood. And here is my list of references. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.